So my name is Jill. I work at Springer Nature in the Nature Research group. I manage our training services for researchers. And I'd like to introduce my panel. I've got Elisa here, who's head of editorial services at Nature Research. I've got Joris Rouleau, who's a managing editor at Veruscript. I've got Alicia Newton, who's a senior editor at Nature Geoscience, and I've got Andrew Preston at the end, who's the co-founder and CEO of Publons. So, our panel this afternoon is going to explore whether we think we're doing enough to support our peer reviewers. So we're going to be focusing on whether we think training is a good way to support them, but let's explore other options as well. As we know, very few peer reviewers receive any kind of training at all. So most will receive on-the-job training, which is basically a euphemism for chucking them in the deep end, their supervisor handing them a manuscript which they have to peer review. And they sometimes get feedback on it, and sometimes they don't. Does this work? Could we be doing better? Who should be providing this training? How should it be delivered? There's so many different types of training that we could provide on different types of peer reviews, so how should we do this? And does it matter? So we've got a lot to cover in this session. All of those questions, hopefully we'll try and come to some consensus on that. But let's first switch it over to you guys. So I wonder how many of you have had a previous life in academia and can answer this question. If you can, think about other academics that you may know who you think may have gone through this, and use your paddles to tell me what kind of training you had on peer review. So did you have any training to perform peer review? This is overwhelmingly red. Got one, no, you're thinking about it? Red. Okay, so it's a green. One green, great. But mainly red, and red from here as well. So a recent study by Taylor and Francis showed that 1 in 10 scientific researchers had some kind of formal training, and by that I mean a workshop or formal training. So whatever that means there. And my experience was similar. I was given a paper, I was told to review it. I went off, I had a look at it, I didn't really understand it. I tried very hard to review it and handed it back to the postdoc in my lab, who never gave me any feedback on it, and that was my one and only brush with peer review. How common is that? Let's ask our panel their experiences. Andrew, I'll start with you at the end.
Yeah, my first experience with peer review, and I think how I learned to review is a little bit different because I submitted a paper, and then seeing the reviews that came back gave me a very quick introduction to what peer review is. So that was my form of training, I would say.
Alicia?
So I guess I might have been one of the more unique ones in that my supervisor ran a journal club in which we actually sort of sat down with a paper each week to look at it and discuss some of the problems that we thought we saw in them, and actually had a bit of discussion and learned to do it through slightly more informal mentoring.
And Joseph, have you had a brush with peer review at all on that side of things?
I have never been a researcher. I've never reviewed a paper. However, I went straight into editorial roles, and it was much the same story, to be honest. I had to evaluate peer review reports, and I was thrown in at the deep end in the same way.
Yeah.
So the first time I reviewed the paper, it took me the entire week, and I wrote 5 pages. And I've been an editor for 4.5 years, and if I had received that as an editor, I would have kicked the person. But that's, nobody told me how to do it, and that's how I did it.
Yeah. So what kind of risks do you think that this lack of formal training, or what kind of risk could this pose to researchers completing peer review for you, your journals now? Alicia.
Yeah, there's a huge question of what sort of quality we're seeing in peer review. And at the Nature journals, we ask not only is this technically correct, that is, did they do their experiments properly, are those experiments actually appropriate for the question that they're asking? But we also ask our reviewers to comment, do you think this is actually exciting? Do you find this exciting? Does this inform your work? Do you think it would inform your colleagues' work? So for someone who's never experienced that, that's a lot to take on board if no one's ever kind of sat down and been like, this is how you look at the methods, this is how you look at the paper more wholly. And I understand for some journals you're really only looking at the methods, but even then I think you run the risk of things being missed or and people just being way more supportive than they should be. Certainly.
I think there is also a problem of managing expectations from the editors and from the reviewers. So if you don't tell them what is it you want from them, you're never going to get it. I mean, they're going to evaluate the paper in the way that they think it's appropriate, but maybe they will miss out on important questions that you would, rather prioritize.
I think that's a really fair point. Someone made the point earlier today that you only need to be a subject expert to peer review. The reality is we've all seen peer reviews which are one line long, don't help the authors, are not maybe use offensive language and so on. There's many more expectations to peer review, and that's what needs to be taught, and that no reviewer knows when they start reviewing all by themselves. And that's these expectations that the journal, the editor has for peer review that we need to pass on.
Is it fair to say it's less of a risk and just more of a systemic kind of inefficiency? Not really as an editor you have to go back and do multiple rounds of review.
And that it's also very difficult for an author if you're getting a report where the reviewer says, I don't like this paper, I just don't feel like you've done enough, and that's it. How do you address that as an author? You're left there like, wait, what? Do you want more interpretation? Do you want more citations? Please tell me how to make this a good paper, because when you're an author, you don't want to publish something that's wrong, because then all your peers are just laughing at you. So we haven't talked about authors as much, but it really is a service for authors as much as it is for the scientific record.
Yeah. And if we then summarize that very few people have had this training, and that this training would benefit or would sort of lessen any bad peer reviews that you get, do you think people would actually want to do this training? I mean, was there a demand for it? Let's ask you guys first, and then I'll ask you.
I think, so the training, really, the idea of the training is to address a quality problem, or at least consistency issues in the quality of peer reviews editors and publishers get. It's not happened yet. I don't know of anyone who's running in-depth trainings. There's workshops here and there at various conferences. Apparently very few people attend them. And I think there's a reason why publishers haven't rolled out this sort of training on a large scale for reviewers, is because there's just no real motivation from the researcher side. There's no real incentive to peer review. Everyone's calling it a thankless task. And a lot of researchers do it on their spare time. They're not, on top of that, going to spend more time to train for it in many ways. Publishers have been trying to address the quality issue in some other ways. I think we're formatting the peer review forms in a specific way. We ask specific questions. None of that is really empowering for reviewers, but it does yield some results. It does ensure in some ways we do get reasonable peer reviews. We try to get the editors to send feedbacks to reviewers, perhaps. So on the one hand, we've as publishers, we've implemented some solutions to try and improve the quality of reviews we get. And on the other hand, there's at the minute, no real incentive for reviewers to take part in a training, which probably would be seen as a waste of time in many ways. So that's one thing to address if we wanted to train our reviewers and empower them to be better reviewers.
I have a little bit of more of a positive view on this. I think younger reviewers, younger researchers, they would want to be trained. I think there's a need for them to understand how the publishing process works in general, and they could learn that through peer review training. So from people I've spoken to, I think they would be open to do this. Obviously, how you do it is the big question, right? So obviously it needs to be a free service because they do the job for free. And I like to think that people really, they do review because they do care about science and they want it to, they want the results that are presented to be right. So in that optic, I think that they would also be willing to train for a few hours to make sure that they do the job well.
Yeah. One thing we've observed with Publons is, as it stands today, it's not very useful as a service if you haven't reviewed before. And yet we find that lots of people who haven't reviewed before sign up. And you got to ask why, and so we do. And what we commonly hear is that people actually want to start reviewing, and particularly because they want to learn about the publishing process and kind of build their expertise that way. So I think for a certain subset of the community, there's demand.
Yeah. Let's just, before we talk about incentivizing that training, I would like to turn it to you guys. And do you think researchers would take part in training if it was run, irrespective of who's providing it or what format it takes? Yeah, let's get onto that later. But do you think people would want to do it? Researchers would take part? Green's one red, green, orange. So I'd say we are about, what do you think, guys?
Mostly
60%,
yes.
70% green.
Very little red.
Yeah, and lots of maybes, yeah. So that Taylor and Francis report also said 55% of science researchers and 51% of HSS researchers said they would take part in some kind of training. And what was interesting from that, which sort of supports what you just said, Andrew, as well, is that many of them wanted to get involved in it, but they weren't sure how. And that was quite a lot of people as well. What can we do then to incentivize people to do this training? I mean, they want to, as you mentioned, Elisa, contribute to their communities, but what else should we be doing, could we do? Any thoughts?
I think making it, and this requires a larger community shift, but making it as worthwhile as we know it is, making sure the rewards and recognition is there for taking part. Like right now when you see CVs, when you're applying for tenure or promotion, it's kind of the very end. I've reviewed for a few of these journals. No one's asking, were you the best reviewer that year? Did you do a kind of, half and half job? But so making sure that people who are looking at hiring and promotion are really recognizing that this is a vital part of how we communicate in academia is so key to making an incentive for being a better reviewer.
Yeah, I think that concept of recognition is critical, obviously. Yeah. But one other thing I'm quite interested in, somebody mentioned it to me just before on the break, is there some sort of need for a qualification or some sort of thing that's kind of recognized widely? I don't know. It's just an idea.
Yeah, I think you couldn't have recognition of peer review on the one hand, and then everyone's doing their own training separately in a non-concerted way. But I think you're right. If people want to do well, reviewers want to do well, they want to do a good job, they don't know where to start. If you offer that training to them, they'd probably take it on. But where does it go? Yeah, in terms of motivation, recognition from the institution is a long way off, probably. I don't know what we can do more immediately, but certainly getting their mentors, getting their supervisors involved would be important. They have to find something in it for them. I heard quite a few reviewers saying one of the reasons why they review is because they get to read papers before anyone else, for example, and they get to see work in progress in some way. Well, if supervisors and mentors pass on that message to their young researchers and say, look, get involved with peer reviewing, we'll train you, we'll show you how to do it well, and you'll get something out of it. You'll become perhaps respected in your community, especially if open reviews are getting increasingly popular. If you make a name for yourself as a good reviewer in an open review environment, that's already, you're getting kudos. But on top of that, if you're sharpening your analytical skills, that benefits your own work, your own research, and your own writing papers as well. So I think if we push that angle, there's a good chance that training would work.
Yeah, I think the writing part is a very important thing that you've just said, because I realized as a young researcher it took me forever to learn how to write a paper, but writing a report is you use very similar skills, so you can hone those skills, that you can later use. And I think from what I think is that if the research community as a whole would kind of make this training integral to PhD courses, for example, so this training should somehow come from the universities as well, maybe in partnership with publishers or whatnot. But I think it should really become a part of the culture that you have to train for becoming a good peer reviewer, in the same way as you train to give presentations or stuff like that.
So can I ask a question about that? At what stage do you, in terms of specific domain knowledge, do you kind of reach the level of expertise required to review? Is it like at the beginning of your PhD, mid-PhD? Like what's that?
I mean, to answer your question, like at Nature, for example, we normally do not ask PhD students to referee papers, so we go at least to junior postdocs. So I think, you know, as a PhD student, you can start to see how the process works, but you don't really have the broad view of the topic and the technical competence to properly assess a work, I think.
Right.
Some of that will depend on the PhD. For the American PhDs, where you're looking at more to 5 to 7 years, where that last few years is kind of the equivalent of a UK postdoc, they might be in a very qualified position, whereas so you'd be looking at that level or first postdoc. And they sometimes have the most sense of the details as well.
You might have more of a captured audience with a PhD student. You might be able to put a bit more pressure on them to train a postdoc is loose in the wild in a way.
So that's a good point. At what level should you target for peer review training, I guess? So do you come in at PhD level or when they're ready to start doing peer review as well?
In the early career scientists workshops I've been to, the PhD students have certainly shown the most interest, and it's something a lot of them feel very conscious about, the fact that they don't have this expertise, but suddenly they'll get their piece of paper next month and be expected to be a brilliant reviewer. And there's this like gap between what they feel like they can do and what they feel is expected of them.
There's actually probably room there maybe to review with your supervisor. You know, your supervisor will ask you to review and they can provide the extra context that you don't necessarily have.
Do you guys think there should be different incentives for sort of people doing the training who are at different levels of their career? So say for an ECR versus a PI who wants to refresh, I don't know if that's why they would do it, but say that was. Do you think there should be different incentives or the same?
I think you probably need different incentives because not everyone, I mean, I think a senior researcher would not naturally think they need training or would not naturally take on a training. And I have seen some pretty bad reviews from very senior researchers, and I think everyone has. So it's not a case of the older you get, the better reviewer you become. Everyone could probably benefit from some training from time to time. And peer review is evolving constantly. This is one of the reasons we've got this conference here. We're talking about open reviews, we're talking about cross reviews, we're talking about new modes of review all the time. In a way, there should be some CPD system where researchers get updated on new ways to do peer review, as they get updated on new ways to do research, new methodologies. But while it'd be reasonably easy perhaps to target the early career researchers, researchers in later stages of their careers would probably require some different types of incentives.
You touched upon something really interesting there, was what this kind of training would have to encompass. So there's so many different types of review. Do you guys want to talk about that a bit? What the different types of review, different journals, how it differs?
Well, I think we can ask a question here. People who review here, vote with your little paddles if you wish. And let us know if you agree with this statement. Do you review always in the same way, regardless of which journal you review for? So there's a few mixed responses. So some people say essentially they always review in the same way. Some say they might adapt their reviewing style to the different journals. I think peer review is probably fairly unique. Varies from journal to journal and will vary over time. Nature's trialing some open review systems. Other publishers have done it.
I think even though the specifics of review will change, I'm confident that there would be a set of core competencies that would span most review in the process of giving feedback. I think we've seen certainly out there, particularly in the field of being an editor, David Mower has pulled together all of these core competencies that goes into being an editor, even though there are lots of different types of editorial processes at journals. So I think there will be some kind of core.
You're right. But I think one of the big benefits of some sort of training for reviewers would be to just to put it out there in front of the reviewers that peer review is not necessarily what they've always done or what they've always known. There's other ways to do peer review, and maybe they might be interested. Maybe they want to bring that into their journal. Maybe they think that's not for us, it won't work in our field or whatever. But at least you broaden the scope of what peer review means to these people.
Yeah, I think this goes along with increased peer review recognition, because if we ask them to go the extra mile and to tell you, all the reasons why the paper is not sound, even though they are not very excited by it, so you ask them to actually do some work on this, more than what you would otherwise do, then we have to find a way to reward them and to incentivize them to do this. Otherwise, they already do this for free, and we can't ask to do like 110%.
Yeah. So because the publishers are asking researchers to do it for free, should publishers be providing the training, or should it be someone else?
I think there's no other way.
No?
Yeah.
I think. Oh yes. Shall we vote?
Yeah. We are having
Publishers
a vote on that in just a second.
Let's vote.
Let's vote now. Okay. So how are we going to do this? So if you think that publishers should give the training, hold up the yellow one. If you think it should be the institutions, the affiliated institutions, let's do the orange. And other, let's do green. Or both, yeah. Thanks, Anna. Yeah, let's do a red for both. Are you going to remember all them? Okay, that's good.
So hang on, what's...
So red is both.
Red is
so it's
both.
overwhelmingly red.
Publishers and institutions.
Publishers were orange. What? No, it's red. There's an orange. Okay, so no one thinks publishers should provide training.
Well, it's both, right?
It's both.
Yeah.
Certainly. And I think writing and reviewing actually have so many core skills in common, and writing is something that's also woefully undertrained in your PhD, unless your supervisor happens to be an awesome writer or you came in an awesome writer. You may be not very good at writing a scientific paper, but there's very similar competencies, and there's no reason that a one-week workshop can't take in both. Because really, if you're going to be a good reviewer, you're probably going to be a good writer, and that will inform how you construct your own paper.
It makes me think maybe we need to also be doing peer review in poetry form as well, right?
Yeah.
Alicia, did you say 1 week workshop?
That was just off the
Okay.
cuff.
All right.
Okay. One of the last questions I wanted to speak to you about was, do you think there's a discrepancy between the support that the researchers would want to see and the support that we'd be able to give them? So do you think they'd want training on something that we can't quite give them? Does that make sense?
I think possibly. So it would be, my perspective is it would be kind of a shame if you spent a week, which is quite, I would say that no one's going to do that, but you're going to spend a significant amount of time doing some sort of training where you don't get something out of it, whether it's something like a qualification that can sit on your CV, or some sort of record of what you've done that shows that you are now an expert in your field or a peer reviewer. I think it'd be tough if you just did the training and got nothing in particular out of it.
I think, you'd have to manage expectations once again and be clear what you're training. You're not going to train them to be great in their field. You're just going to give some core principles about peer review, and like Andrew says, if they know they can use some sort of accreditation across any journal they like, it can't be publisher proprietary or anything. It has to be publisher agnostic. If they can use their skill across any journal they like, and they know they'll benefit from it, I think there's little risk that they'll expect something else from the training.
If they can use it across any journal, then it may benefit any journal. Do you think it's something that would benefit editors as well?
Yeah, definitely, I think so. Because as was discussed earlier in one of the sessions, then it's difficult for editors to find good referees, and you just do that by, trial and error, if you like. But if there was some sort of accreditation system, then it would make life easier for editors as well. And overall, it would just make the process more reliable and
more
fairer
efficient,
and efficient,
Well, I think you're right. You're right in the sense, I think, that if editors contact vetted reviewers, as it were, there's less likelihood that they'll have to deal with a poor quality peer review report later down the line. So in that sense, they don't waste their time. They don't have to remind reviewers. They don't have to ask them to rewrite their report or invite someone else. On the other hand, if you've got a small pool of vetted reviewers and a big pool of non-vetted reviewers, all the editors would want the good guys, and the competition for the good reviewers might just increase and make it even more difficult to find the good reviewers. I don't know.
Well, I guess hopefully in the long term, then you would have the majority of referees that are accredited.
Hopefully,
yeah, hopefully, if it's a scheme that then it's widely adopted. Yeah.
Certainly. We notice in countries where it might be hard to track someone's publication record, like so finding the westernized version of a Chinese person's name and trying to track their publication record and see what they're actually working on can be incredibly difficult, so limits the amount that someone with a very common name will be asked to participate in peer review. So if you've got an accreditation and it goes along with a page that tells you what your expertise is and things like that, it will open up a new pool of reviewers who might really want to review and be quite competent, but are just being overlooked because we can't find them on a quick Google search.
I think what you said is probably a key point, is this pool of early career researchers, and someone else mentioned it in another session as well, who want to review but don't know how to go about becoming a reviewer. These reviewers probably can get accredited and get fed onto a system where they are visible to editors looking for reviewers. And that's probably that probably would be a good incentive for everyone and make the system work.
Yeah, I think what we're really talking about in terms of accrediting or training reviewers is actually two things. One is expanding the pool of potential reviewers, making it bigger, but then also potentially improving the quality of existing reviewers. And both things go a long way towards speeding up science, right? These things are fundamentally good.
Andrew, you mentioned something a bit earlier on about mentoring being really important. Do you think that could be part of a training that you run or anyone runs?
I think it's going to be essential, and for the specific reason that there are two things that go into review: domain-specific knowledge and knowing how to conduct a review in the way that the journal wants. And so for the domain-specific knowledge, for any sort of accreditation that spreads across more than a few journals or more than a few fields, you're going to have people who are experts providing some sort of mentorship or insight. So one of the things we've looked at is, can you, as part of some sort of accreditation process, actually write a review, whether it's used or not? And to get any sort of feedback on that, you're going to need some sort of mentorship and feedback on the process. So I think it's absolutely essential.
Key part of it. Great. So what we've covered just now is that very few people have had training from the room. We think researchers would probably attend the training. The training has to encompass a wide range of different things, but there are some core values that would certainly appeal, and mentorship is a key component of that. And it would benefit editors as well. Any final thoughts?
One thing, I think what is coming across surveys that we run for Nature journals is that like reviewers really want to know how useful their report was and why was it useful, what did they do that was excellent. So we really need to improve the way editors give feedback to referees on specific points of their reports to make them feel valued as well, because we just they just send the report in and then maybe don't hear anything back for months, and then the paper gets published and they just don't they don't see what the process is and why the editor value their feedback so much. So we need to really improve. As publishers, we need to do that better.
I totally agree, and I think it's part of the bigger picture. Training reviewers is all very well, but we have to respect their work beyond just training them. Recognition involves also keeping them up to date with the status of a paper after they have reviewed. Perhaps letting them having a discussion with the editor, perhaps with the authors during revision about the paper, being part of the process of improving that paper beyond just this one of peer review, and then seeing the paper after it's been published and so on. So I think it's rewarding reviewers, respecting reviewers, giving them more updates and information on a specific article they've worked on, all together with training will guarantee more engagement and better quality. It's got to all work together. We can't just train people and then not not communicate with them afterwards, after the fact, and let them alone.
Yeah, more communication.
Yeah.
I'm going to open up for questions now. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask? Lots. Okay.
Wow.
Start there. With Ed.
It seems to me that one way, is there any facility at Publons for assessing the quality of the reviews received? I know you get a tick for the number of times that you have edited for a journal, but have you thought about integrating some sort of flag that editors could say, this is an awesome review, click, and then you get an extra brownie point? Because that would be incentive for reviewers to do courses to become better peer reviewers and also to provide better peer review.
Yeah, so it's a great question. There are two ways to recognize a review. One is on the overall quantity or amount of review that you're doing and verifying it, absolutely. But beyond that, there has to be room for people who go above and beyond and do high quality reviews and basically produce outstanding reviews. So that's the general principle. For quite some time, Publons has focused on building up the ability to measure the quantity of reviews you're doing. But we do have now a facility where editors can evaluate reviewers and provide feedback, because that's really important. Being able to evaluate and provide feedback, which are slightly different things. But we do have a system now where if editors want to sign up and participate in this process, they can do that. And the net result is if you are rated highly enough by an editor, you will get a star essentially beside your review, which says that this is an outstanding review, you've gone above and beyond. And that will contribute to your merit and be available on your downloadable report that you'll take to publishers and everything. So very important, and something that we have in place. The big challenge for us is going to be getting uptake from editors. Editors really need to buy into this. Yeah.
And it turns out actually there's a gigantic dearth of some sort of systematic way to evaluate what is an excellent review.
Yeah.
I think like the best thing is a rubric that dates back to maybe the early 90s and is so subjective as to be useless. So you have to almost kind of set up what is your core definition of excellence, and that's something we might need to agree on.
Absolutely, yeah. And that comes back to understanding those core competencies probably that we spoke of that go into doing review.
Andrew, can I ask briefly, does it work in terms of motivating reviewers and incentivizing reviewers to give them badges and stars and stuff like that?
I think for a certain class of researcher or person, badges and stars and that sort of thing does work. It's not for everybody. But what we're really focused on with Publons isn't necessarily badges and stars. It's doing something that's good for your career. And that works for a lot of people. So the sorts of things that are good for your career is being able to highlight that you're an expert in your field, and also being able to take what you've done and present it in a performance review, a funding application, those sorts of things.
Or green card.
Or a green card, yes.
I've had professors from Columbia University ask me for a reference because they were peer reviewers when they were applying for their green card.
Wow.
CPD is the other one, continuing professional development.
Another question?
Hi, mine's actually, you just touched on it now, which is there's been a lot of talk about accreditation and training, and I do think, agree entirely it's important to an extent, but I think you just touched on the fact that do we actually know what a good review looks like? Ivan Aransky gave a fantastic example earlier where this fellow was reviewing his own papers and sent in reviews which had all the secondary characteristics. Ooh, there goes my phone. Long, detailed, it sounded concise, but they were complete rubbish. Intentionally so in this case, and I'm sure most aren't. And we see quite a lot of people saying this is a good review because it's 10 pages long, but it completely missed the fact that it was fully falsified. Yeah. And I think what's really peculiar about this argument that and I've heard it go around here as well, is that we're still separating the purpose of review from what makes a good review. And surely a good review is one that selects the good papers. So how can we therefore sort what a good review is without what a good paper is, which is peer review, and I'm really struggling. I agree we want to do what we can to support it, but conceptually I can't even see how we could begin to crack this. The only instrument I knew is the RQI, which you just mentioned, the review quality instrument, which has awful inter-rater reliability. They tried to improve it with the MRQI from Stanford. It's almost worse. And I just generally struggle. I'd be very interested in knowing how you, beyond this rather nebulous, the editor thinks they're good, which is proven complete useless for everything else, how could we actually do this?
I think you could have a few semi-objective measures, you could ensure that the reviewer has addressed specific points in your article, and that would vary from journal to journal, discipline to discipline. Now, some very basic things. Is the language all right? Has the reviewer looked at the statistical analysis? Has the reviewer commented on the methodology and not just the results? That sort of thing. You could like tick boxes almost in that way. And you wouldn't be able to tell if it's been a fraud if the reviewer has written some rubbish in that box, but you would be able that in theory, has addressed that question, and then the editor is here to see, qualitatively speaking, if that makes sense or not.
I mean, as Alicia has done a lot of work in this area with other colleagues from the Nature journals, and they have spent months identifying criteria, right?
And it's probably more subjective than the rubric at this stage. But, and I think it's going to really vary by journal to some extent, because sometimes as a Nature type editor, it's someone pointing out, actually, we found this back in the 90s. It's been forgotten from the literature, but they've just retapped it. Therefore, it may be methodologically great, but we don't think it's very exciting. The editor then assesses that and agrees, no, this is not what we want to publish. So for an author, that's probably the worst review you want to get, and it's not helpful to you, but to an editor it is. So there's this massive balance on, are we looking at what's good for the author? Are we looking at what's good for the journal? Are we looking at the scientific community as a whole? And I'm talking and I have no answers. So it's a very long way of saying, despite a couple years and a lot of surveys, we're really not much better than that rubric.
Another question?
Stephanie Dawson from Science Open. We're talking a lot about early career researchers, and I see that as a group of people who are growing up in this internet world where they write reviews of everything. They write reviews of songs and movies and the popcorn maker they bought on Amazon. Can't we harness that somehow? And I really haven't heard that coming up very much. This is a whole group of people who are really good at writing reviews, and we have the possibility in all of these other spaces to crowdsource. So it really matters. You can get a better view if you have 100 reviews than if you have only 2 reviews. And I was thinking about that this morning in the poetry review session. I was seeing, there was a huge range of different people with different opinions, and people had totally different frameworks for how they were reviewing this. But if you just picked out 2, they could be completely, non-representative. So I would like to see more reviews. I would like to see maybe even shorter reviews. I would like to see a different kind of review, because I think could we maybe pick those people up and train them on the things that they're already good at?
I think my answer to that, if I can say, is that I'm not sure necessarily that increasing the number to, let's say, hundreds of reviewers on a paper, crowdsourcing as we do for the TripAdvisor, would be the answer. But on the other hand, if you would publish the reports for a given paper, and then people can comment with like or not on the report and saying this is actually a useful thing because this, they managed to find the difficult part of the problem in the paper has been found, or if they say this report was rubbish because they neglected these other major aspects. So I think, at the stage where referees comment on a paper, I don't know if having 10 people commenting, first of all, is efficient, because you waste a lot of time for a lot of people. But then commenting on the report to the same, along the lines of what we do on TripAdvisor or Amazon or whatnot, I think that's something that we don't do at all at the moment. First of all, because most of the reports are not published, but it's really something that I think we should look into. I don't know if you have other views on this?
Yeah, that's what Andrew said. We need to be able to, maybe not to rank, but to assess the quality of the reviewers through their quantity and quality of their reviews.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I've got 2 thoughts on this. It's near and dear to my heart, so I won't speak too long on it. But one thing when we talk about review and reviews for TripAdvisor or Amazon or whatever, that we tend to ignore is the editor. And I actually think in science or research in general, the peer review process and the amount of honesty and openness that's required probably for a long time is going to require editor facilitation. That's, I think, a key thing that we tend to forget when we talk about having hundreds of reviews for a paper. So that's one potential issue. The other thing is when we're talking about shorter reviews, we're actually talking about breaking up a review into lots of little specific things. And I think that's very interesting when you talk about overall review actually being a focus on a few different things. Breaking those up, I think, is a very, very interesting thing that we should be talking more about.
Hi, Maria Levchenko from Europe PMC. It's fascinating to see that people are discussing at which point to introduce training to the peer review, because for me, coming as a young researcher, it should be as early as possible. I think that reviewing literature is about critically assessing papers, and this is a skill that everybody needs, probably even before they're starting PhD. In my life, I've been first trained on scientific ethics before I was allowed to start any experiments. And I do believe that having such a training in peer review would benefit dramatically in the way I've read the literature, I've later interacted with it. And this is, of course, a personal opinion, and I believe there is also potential in targeting older researchers, but I think it's the youngest generation that should be the target of such training. And I think for them, there is no need to provide an incentive. They need to learn to read the articles, so they need to learn how to review them.
Yeah. I think that would be actually an interesting question to turn out to everyone else. It should peer review training be required before you start or progress in your PhD? Get your paddles up and go. More greens, some yellow.
Lots of greens, yellows.
A couple rejects.
80% green.
Sorry.
No.
Have we got time for a few more questions?
Sean McRae, editorial manager. One of the strategies that comes up when talking to our customers for improving review quality is sharing the reviews, either before or after publication. Is this something that the panel does? Do we think it's a good idea? Anybody got any examples?
This is something we're looking into. I've talked to a few people that seem to think it's a good idea, a few reviewers who seem quite excited by the idea.
In general, at Nature Geoscience, we will send all the reviews to each reviewer, especially as we often have reviewers with very different expertise. I think it gives a unique window into different ways of reading a manuscript.
Is it a useful learning tool for the other referees?
Definitely.
Yeah.
One more question? A couple more?
I'm Eric Cobo. I'm academic at Barcelona Tech and working for Trials and Biomed Central. My question is about editors. Editors are making the most important decisions, and we are always talking about reviewers. And editors probably reject half of the papers without revisions. So what do you think about the way we are selecting and we are training editors?
Well, I guess this varies, from publisher to publisher and from journal to journal. I mean, each journal will have certain selection criteria that will vary depending on the journal. And when, at least at Nature journals, when you start, you jump from academia to publishing, you get given training on what your new job is about and what kind of criteria you're applying, and you're supported by senior colleagues in making the decisions for several months. It's a very long process, a steep learning curve. So, I don't know if your question is more about to the lines, along the lines of why do we give editors let's say the power to reject that many papers? But I think it's a different question in the sense that if that's what, no one forces a certain author to go to a certain journal. If they wish to do so, then they have to kind of play by the rules of that journal. If the editor is the prerogative of choosing what gets published in that particular journal, then that's what it is. You don't have to go to the journal if you don't agree with those criteria. That's what I'm saying. But rest assured that at least I can speak for our family of journals. Editors, when they start, they do receive training, and they to the extent that they can then kind of walk on their own legs. So it takes several months, but eventually they learn how to do it.
More generally, though, I think that most papers. Microphone? No. Sorry, I think this is an important point. That it's not just Nature editors, but I think you're absolutely right. Most papers are accepted in academic journals, and academic editors have many different stripes. And so I think publishers should be thinking more about how we train our academic journals, such as many of the academic editors, such as work from some of the B&C journals, many of the Springer journals, many of the Elsevier journals. I think that's a very good point.
Yeah, sorry, I was talking for professional editors.
Yeah,
I was talking just for professional editors.
It has to be part of this.
You're absolutely right. What you described for Nature's editors, I know is not true of all academic editors for all journals. I was unfortunate enough to have to deal with the Moon case that Ivan Orensky described earlier. And by sheer chance, I bumped into the problem of an author who submitted dozens of manuscripts in the space of only a few years. And the editor-in-chief appeared to have accepted all these papers on the basis of reviews by the suggested reviewers, which were returned within 24 hours. Clearly, there's a need to train editors as well. Yeah. But it's not the same need as training reviewers. There are not so many editors in the first place, and they have a much closer relationship, or they should have a much closer relationship with the publishers in the first place. So you don't have to have necessarily the systematic training early on in the career that you would implement for reviewers. You could do that on an ad hoc basis when a new editor comes on board.
There's one in the back.
Yes, hi, Noah Moxham, St Andrews History. There's been a lot of talk about incentivizing peer reviewers, and the word paying them hasn't been mentioned nowhere. I get this is a publishers' conference and it's probably not the most popular idea in the room, but it does nevertheless strike researchers as unusual that it is the one form of service to the profession that they're expected to undertake and which they're expected to undertake for free. And I'm not sure that incentivizing them with, I think a week's training is unrealistic, as Andrew suggested, but really sort of training of any kind, taking a day away from their already busy schedules is not necessary. It's going to have to really be strong stuff in order to justify the time it takes away. And I think perhaps a better system would be if groups like Nature, which perhaps have some resources to throw at this, were to put really detailed advice and guidance on their websites rather than just sort of perfunctory bullet points. Make it something that peer reviewers can access without having to come to you, but just by going on your website. That, I think, would be appreciated in an area where researchers, I think, feel somewhat taken for granted.
If I can answer the point on pay, at least for what concerns our group. As I said, we do run referee surveys, and the majority of people do not want to get paid. They think that actually paying referees would skew the system because you would get people that just do it for the money. While the majority, like I think the number was like 70% of people or something like that, that would rather not get paid because they think pay would make the service less reliable. I'm just telling you the results, so you can question that if it's true or not. But then in terms of resources on the website, so they're more accessible, I fully agree with that. I think with the with the Nature masterclasses, we are going along those lines. So it's a perfectly valid point. But I'm questioning just for what we can see from our surveys that referees do not want to get paid. Sure.
Did you ask them whether they wanted to get paid, or did you offer to pay them? There's a difference between...
No, we asked them what form of recognitions or reward do you want, and then there's various choices, and the majority of them doesn't want to get paid, and then we asked them, do you think that paying would be a good system? And they say no, because that would skew the process.
We pay reviewers. There's very few publishers doing it. We only knew Collabra, which is run by the University of California, pays reviewers as well. They are pretty new. I agree with Alicia. A lot of the surveys show that It's very contentious. In principle, researchers don't want to get money involved in the peer review activity, or in many research activities anyway. In practice, again, it's too early for us to tell, but in practice, I've seen like maybe 2 reviewers out of 40 or 50 declining the payment. So I think there is scope. It's not the only solution, but it's got the benefit of being universal and really meaning that you care about your reviewers. Everyone would, I think, understand and accept that before we can convince institutions to include reviewing in their research excellence framework. I think paying them is, if you can try it, it's worth trying.
Some other things that prove popular in surveys are other sorts of rewards, like getting letters of recognition that they can put in their promotion packages, and also just discounted subscriptions or discounts on APCs in journals if they chose to then publish in that journal. And I think some other journals are experimenting with, you earn a certain number of credits for peer reviewing and you need to hit that before you can publish, and you might be able to publish for free at those credits.
So reviewers are paid to review, just like authors are paid to publish. And we don't have any problem with authors finding ways to even pay to publish, right? The key thing there is it's part of your job description as a researcher. It's part of your job to communicate to the research, or to contribute to the research community. So there is an indirect way in which you are paid today and kind of expected to contribute to research, 100%. But what we're talking about here is a problem with incentives, right? And the people who get incentives really well are economists. And so what I would suggest checking out is there's a Journal of Economics Research or something published out of Harvard, and they've done all sorts of studies on the peer review process and different ways to speed up the peer review process and the quality, improve the quality. And I don't remember the exact results, but they looked at paying reviewers versus changing the required deadline for when a review needs to be returned, and which thing actually sped up the process the most. I think it was an Elsevier journal. It was a very interesting study. And it turned out that just changing the deadline from, I think, 6 weeks to 3 weeks when the review is due to be returned actually improved the peer review process more than offering $100 for the review. Something like that. I don't remember the exact results, but go and check it out. It's very interesting.
What they did as well is they had one group in which they published how long it took a reviewer to do his review with the article, and that had a fairly big effect as well, I think.
Can you take one last question? Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Namdar Bagai, as the biotech consultants. I'm part-time academic, part-time biotech company. I act as reviewer for 2 biotechnology journals, as well as being a reviewer for research councils and Innovate UK. And I think we talked obviously today all about scientific publishing and everything, but there is a whole body of learning, I think, with the research councils and funding bodies, that they do actually give you training to do your reviews. You know, when I joined BBSRC to do their reviewers, there was a full day of training to do that. And I think there is a lot of learning from that process to use for the scientific publishing. That's something maybe.
Yeah. That's interesting that funders are providing this as well then. Thank you everyone for the questions, and thank you to our panelists for a very lively discussion. And yeah, that's the end. Thanks.